Hello, everyone. My name is Kenneth Vail. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology. I was very honored last year to win the Outstanding Research Award for 2021, and I'm also very happy to spend some time with you today to tell you about some of the research that we do in my lab. My lab is called the Social Psychology and Existential Attitudes Research Lab, which gives it the acronym SPEAR Lab, and I think that fits quite well with the Viking mascot theme that we have here at CSU. Now, in SPEAR Lab, I do psychological science together with a team of 4 very talented graduate students and a small group of about a half dozen undergraduate research assistants, as well as some local high school students in advanced STEM programs. And together we work in an exciting new field called the science of existential psychology, which is focused on better understanding the many important ways that fundamental issues of being and becoming impact our everyday life. Now, I'm also the president of the scientific society in the discipline called the International Society for the Science of Existential Psychology. So what I want to do here today is give you a brief overview of the science of existential psychology, while also illustrating how we study it using quantitative experimental methods and highlighting some of our recent research on the topic along the way. Now, I want to start our overview by asking you to think a little bit about philosophy. Specifically, think about the philosophical question of being, of looking at the world and trying to figure out what are things. Because since the days of Plato and Aristotle, but actually probably a lot longer before that, one way that people have thought about the nature of things is to ask, what is the thing's essence? That is to say, what is its essential characteristic and its essential purpose? So let's take an example of a chef's knife. So if you think about the knife, the handle can be made of wood or rubber or metal, or you can even take the handle away entirely if you want, but it's still a knife. So what we learned from that line of thinking is that the handle is not an essential component to what it means to be a knife. But you can't really do that with the blade, right? If a knife doesn't have a blade capable of cutting things, then it's not really a knife anymore. So one conclusion and interpretation of that line of thinking is to say that the blade is an essential component of what it means to be a knife, and thus the essence of the knife is to cut. So at least for objects, we can also say that essence precedes existence. I developed the idea of cutting things, and so I create an object like a chef's knife with the relevant essential characteristic, that being of a blade, for the essential purpose of cutting. And yes, it's true that you can use a knife for other purposes, like turning screws or opening jar lids or picking your teeth, but the knife isn't optimized for those things. It's in its optimal state of being when it's being used for its essential purpose, which is to say, here, to cut things. So now, if you think about yourself as an object in the world, it can be easy to fall into a similar line of thinking, right? You can ask yourself, why am I here? Who am I really? And what is the purpose of my life? And those questions are actually leading questions because they tacitly assume that there must be some predefined system of meaning, and you must have been created for some specific predefined purpose within that system of meaning. And that leading assumption inherent in those kinds of questions have consequences because they can lead us to think that the main challenge of being human is to unearth that essential predefined purpose for your existence, as if it came from somewhere else and was embedded in you, and it's just waiting to be found and fulfilled. So when we think like this, right, we ask ourselves questions that probably everybody here has asked themselves. It's stuff like, what is my true self? What is my essential purpose? What are the essential qualities that I possess that are aligned with that purpose? And how can I engage that purpose to its fullest potential? And how does it all fit together into a broader predefined system of meaning? And this type of thinking, which assumes that essence precedes existence, is a very intuitive and very pervasive way of thinking about the world and about our human nature. However, the modern age began to cast a shadow on that idea the idea that we humans exist to participate in some predefined grandiose meaning system or to fulfill some mysterious essential purpose hidden within us. For example, the modern scientific method has been teaching us that the physical machinations of the universe are actually rather indifferent to us. Electrons orbit, chemicals bond, and entire galaxies are formed and destroyed, and it all has absolutely nothing seemingly to do with us. Further, advances in human biology and the life sciences have been revealing that although we do have some superficial differences between us, otherwise we humans are all pretty much the same, whereas careful observations of humans later post-neonatal development seems to suggest that the majority of differences in what people report as their essential purpose and the activities that they passionately pursue seem to vary systematically with their cultural environments and their life circumstances. And as a result, some philosophers began to argue that the universe doesn't have any inherent meaning to it, and that we humans actually don't come preloaded with any inherent purpose in life, and that any essence or purpose in life that we do perceive exists purely because we create it for ourselves. So they began to reject that age-old idea that essence precedes existence, and they started to flip that around. And they began to argue that existence precedes essence. In other words, that we exist first, and that it's then up to us to fashion our own sense of life's meaning and purpose in the contexts and environments that we find ourselves inhabiting. Now, that position, of course, is the basis for the branch of philosophy called existentialism. But to live such an examined and self-determined life requires us to continually grapple with things like the fragile nature of our existence and the absurdity or the objective meaninglessness of reality, as well as our fundamental freedom to determine what to do, who to be, how, and why. And now the emergence of the science of existential psychology as a field on top of that philosophical revolution is a relatively new thing. You may be familiar with the philosophical movement, right? That in the 1840s, just a few years prior to Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species, Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard was the first to put existentialist philosophical ideas down on paper, and his work was then followed in the late 1800s by the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky and Friedrich Nietzsche. And then in the 1900s, it was followed by the works of Martin Heidegger, and then the French existentialists Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Albert Camus, among a whole host of others throughout Europe. But what you may not have known is that the central ideas of existentialism that they were developing spread rather quickly, and they were further developed and applied across a variety of other academic domains and therapeutic disciplines. For example, throughout the early and mid-1900s, existentialism enabled new insights in theology and sociology, cultural anthropology, and psychology. And therapists began developing a wide variety of applications of existentialism to areas like neurology, psychiatry, and psychotherapy. The science side of things, in particular the psychological science of things, however, was held back and obstructed for a few decades because prior to the start of the cognitive revolution in psychology, in the 1950s and 60s, the dominant view called behaviorism assumed that the internal mental experiences, such as our cognitive and emotional handling of existential concerns, were simply beyond the reach of scientific study and therefore should not even be attempted to be studied scientifically. But eventually in the 1970s and 80s, the cognitive revolution had its day and had successfully developed techniques to systematically and quantitatively and scientifically study the inner mental processes that we have, as well as their external behavioral indicators. So equipped with the emerging methods at the time, researchers in the 70s and 80s began conducting and publishing some of the first scientific tests of existentialist ideas. And that early work established that it was indeed possible to apply the scientific method to productively study the psychological impact of existential concerns in our everyday lives. And as a result, interest in the science of existential psychology spread throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, during which researchers began developing novel theoretical perspectives and innovative research methods to assess the roles of various existential concerns in an increasingly broad range of human experience. And throughout the past couple decades, the field has just boomed. It's really grown exponentially. And now we have an entire field of thousands of researchers around the world using contemporary methods of psychological science to study the ways that core issues of being and becoming influence human social and mental life, including dynamic psychological processes about things like the awareness of mortality, or freedom, authenticity, and moral responsibility, or culture, the self and social identity, or isolation, uncertainty, and shared reality, or even the quest for meaning and purpose in life itself, among a host of other important processes as well, with naturally implications for a broad range of nearly every corner of human life, from art and sports and politics to work and love, to religion and spirituality, to personal growth, and to physical and psychological health and well-being, among many others, of course. And over the past 30 years or so, the general strategy has been to distill the many provocative ideas of existential psychology into formal psychological theory with falsifiable hypotheses about the role of existential concerns in human thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and then test those ideas by applying the modern methods of contemporary psychological science. For example, and this is a massive oversimplification, but one theory in existential psychology argues that religion is so pervasive and so important to people, not because it's divinely inspired or based on any inherent truth, but because it's a powerful psychological tool that helps to mitigate our existential concerns about life and death. So with that theory in mind, right, we can then develop falsifiable hypotheses and design scientific studies to test that idea. For example, a formal hypothesis in the form of an if-then statement would sound a little bit like this. If religious faith is, at least in part, a psychological tool to help manage the awareness of death, then as the awareness of death increases, well, so should the strength of one's religious faith. And one of the first and the most popular methods that researchers have used to try to test that hypothesis has involved correlational designs and field studies. So researchers would develop and administer quantitative measures of a person's death-related anxiety and quantitative measures of a person's strength of their religious faith. And then they'd collect data from hundreds of participants, sometimes thousands. And once they collect all that data, they'd compute statistical correlations or sometimes more complex regression models to see if death anxiety was associated with religious faith. And over the past 30 years or so, there have been over 100 correlational studies that have reported data on the association between death anxiety and religious faith. But it turned out actually that correlational data weren't particularly helpful here. If you're familiar with the phrase correlation is not causation, you can start to get a sense of why. Because in most of these studies, the data seemed, at least on its surface, to support the hypothesis. Death anxiety in most studies has been observed to be positively correlated with strength of religious faith, meaning that as death anxiety increased, so did the strength of participants' religious belief. But the problem is that you could also interpret that data pattern from the other angle. As religious belief increased, so did death anxiety, which would seem to contradict the theory's idea that religious faith helps to mitigate death anxiety. Additionally, in some of the studies that were reported, death anxiety was actually negatively correlated with strength of religious faith, meaning that as death anxiety increased, the strength of participants' religious faith decreased, which would seem on its face to be yet another contradiction of the theory's idea that death anxiety motivates increased religious faith. But again, you could flip that lens around and look at it through the other causal pathway and interpret that pattern the other way around and argue instead that the negative correlation shows that as religious belief increased, death anxiety decreased, which would seem to be consistent with the theory's idea that religious faith helps to mitigate death anxiety. So over 100 studies in the past 30 years or so were reliably finding associations between death anxiety and religious faith. But the ambiguities of correlational methods meant that it was almost impossible for these data to tell us whether the theory was right and existential concern was activating increased religious faith as a way to try to help mitigate existential concern, or whether the theory was wrong and that it was somehow leading to reduced faith, or that faith was somehow making death anxiety worse. So I found that situation to be just immensely frustrating because I wanted to know, does religion serve this existential function, or does it make it worse, right? Does it make the existential concern worse? So correlational methods were clearly not getting us anywhere informative because correlation is not causation. You can't know for sure whether variable A is causing changes in variable B, or whether variable B is causing changes in variable A, and that presents a huge obstacle to interpreting the pattern and learning whether a theory is right or needs to be modified. But you can know about those causal paths with experimental designs. So my colleagues and I decided to try to run some lab experiments to see if we could figure this out. Now, our experimental strategy was that we would create two groups of participants. One group of participants would be our baseline group. So we would just sort of leave those folks alone psychologically, I guess, so to speak. We would prompt them to think about and write about a control topic for a few minutes, but we wouldn't prompt them to think about anything related to death or any existential concerns like that. Whereas our other group would be our target group. So with this group, we would intentionally prompt them to think about and write about the concept of death for a few minutes to increase their awareness of the concept of mortality. And then we would turn each participant onto a few other little distractor tasks, and then we would have them do our dependent variable, which was to have them quantify the strength of their religious beliefs. So things like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how religious are you? How strongly do you believe in a higher power? How much do you agree with the following statements? God exists. God answers prayers. God sometimes intervenes in worldly matters. That kind of stuff. And then what we would do is we would calculate the average score for participants in each group to see whether the increased awareness of mortality influenced people's religious faith. And if so, how? Like in what direction? Did it make it stronger or weaker? And what we found was that compared to the baseline condition, when we increased existential concern with death, participants increased the strength of their faith. So this is a simple study, but it's super straightforward, and it clearly resolved the question, right? There was not any ambiguity any longer about whether one variable was impacting the other or vice versa, because it was an experiment. We now knew for sure that the awareness of death was psychologically motivating religious faith. And this data pattern emerged when we looked at it with Christians here in the US, but it also emerged when we did a similar study with Muslims in Iran. And our colleagues also started to use this experimental design approach, and they too found the same data patterns over and over. But one interesting thing is that in some of these studies that I was running, I was also finding that atheists don't do this. So they abstain from religious belief, obviously, and they invest instead in secular cultural concepts rather than, supernatural concepts about souls and gods and heaven and stuff like that. And so what we were finding was that, sure enough, like over and over in our own experiments, but also in experiments run by other labs, the data were showing that atheists reject religious belief, whether they're in the baseline condition or the death awareness condition. And so that gave us a whole bunch of ideas, and we saw a great opportunity to start testing this theory even further and test whether religious belief might help protect existential well-being, even when believers do become aware of the concept of death. Because so far here, right, we've seen that religious believers respond to the increased awareness of death by increasing their faith, whereas atheists don't. So if the theory is true and religious belief is a useful psychological tool that people can use to help mitigate existential concerns, then religious people should still report a strong sense of meaning in life, even if we prompt them to think about the concept of death, whereas atheists won't have that same benefit, right? And sure enough, my colleague and I found that compared to the baseline condition, increased awareness of the concept of death made atheists report lower levels of meaning in life. But that didn't happen for Christians. Their religious faith helped them to psychologically cope with that existential concern and preserved their healthy levels of meaning in life, even when we reminded them of mortality. So each of these data patterns are consistent with that idea that I described earlier, that one of the reasons why religion is so pervasive and so important to people is because it's a powerful psychological tool that helps us to mitigate our existential concerns about life and death. And it also illustrates how we can take existentialist philosophical ideas that are developed in disciplines like philosophy and anthropology and so on, and turn them into formal psychological theory that we can then test using the methods of modern psychological science. Now, a more central theme in much of existentialist philosophy itself is the idea that the awareness of mortality is what orients us to our freedom and motivates us to want to be our most authentic self in any given moment. For example, Martin Heidegger devoted a lot of attention to this idea in his classic work, Being and Time. And so did a lot of other thinkers who came after him. Now, to completely oversimplify one of his main ideas, the basic gist is that the human experience is fundamentally characterized by the conscious experience of freedom and choice. But we only really consciously engage in that freedom to choose because we know that we're mortal. So say, for the sake of argument and illustration, say that there are just 100 possible careers that you could do. If you lived forever, you could simply do each one of those careers. You could even do them over and over and over again if you wanted, for no other reason than just to not be bored. But the thing is that you don't live forever, and you know that. You are mortal, and thus your time is limited, right? You can't study everything in school. You can't do every career. You just don't have enough time. So you have to pick and choose the things in life that you're going to do. And that means that you have to figure out what you care about most, and you have to persistently choose and pursue those things. And sometimes that can be a challenge for sure. And people like Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Sartre all lamented that sometimes people feel anxiety about the challenges of actually living authentically. But my point here is that we can take those philosophical ideas and distill them down into formal psychological theory and testable hypotheses. In this case, one hypothesis that the concept of mortality is one of the psychological phenomena that motivates us toward authentic living. And another hypothesis that feeling that sense of authenticity is one major way that we can maintain a sense of well-being in the face of existential concerns about life and death. So we started testing, and we started with that first hypothesis that increased awareness of mortality would increase motivation toward authentic living. And we did that in one experiment by randomly assigning participants to either a baseline condition or a target condition, where we prompted them to think about the concept of death for a few minutes. And then we had them quantify the degree to which they desired to feel autonomous. So like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much would you like to be free to do what you choose? And be free from external pressures and be able to do what really interests you. And then we calculated the average score for participants in each group. And what we found was that compared to the baseline condition, when we increased existential concern about death, participants increased their desire for personal autonomy. And we did another study like this, where at the beginning of the college semester, we had students in Psych 101 make quantitative ratings, like on a scale of 1 to 10, where higher scores indicated that they felt Psych 101 was aligned with their authentic self, and lower scores indicated that it conflicted with their authentic self, like if they felt that the only reason they were there was because it was a requirement for their major, that kind of thing. Then a month later, we brought them into the lab for a lab session. And in the lab session, we randomly assigned them to either a baseline condition or a target condition, where we prompted them to think about the concept of mortality for a few minutes. And then we had them quantify their level of motivation toward the course. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you look forward to attending your Psych 101 class sessions? Or, and this is a reverse scored item, like how much would you rather just zone out and focus on other things when you're in your Psych 101 class? And so what we found was that when students felt that Psych 101 was not aligned with their authentic self, then compared to the baseline condition, the increased awareness of mortality reduced their motivation to attend and engage the course material. But when students felt that Psych 101 was aligned with their authentic self, the increased awareness of mortality increased their motivation to attend and engage with that course. So the data patterns in both of these experiments were consistent with that first hypothesis, finding that the concept of mortality is indeed one of these psychological phenomena that motivate us toward authentic living. And we also tested the second hypothesis, that feeling a sense of authenticity is one way that we can maintain a sense of well-being in the face of existential concerns about life and death. And the way that we tested this idea was by first measuring the awareness of mortality. We did this using a word stem completion task, where we asked participants to complete 15 partially completed words. But what they didn't know was that we had set it up so that 6 of those words could be completed in either neutral ways or in death-related ways. So for example, GR dash 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 could be completed in neutral ways, like the word grant or grape, but it could also be completed in a death-related way, like the word grave. So the idea is that if the concept of mortality was not active, then participants wouldn't necessarily be particularly likely to complete those word stems in death-related ways. But if death was, quote unquote, on the mind, so to speak, then people would be more likely to complete those word stems in death-related ways. And we can then just add up the number of death-related word completions to get a quantitative measure of the activation of death-related thoughts. And so that's how we quantitatively measured death thought accessibility. And then we had participants quantify their current level of self-determination or authentic orientation. We did that on a scale of 1 to 10, had them say, basically on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you feel free to do what you choose? And how much do you feel free from external pressures? And how much do you feel able to do what really interests you, and so on. And in one study, the outcome variable, our dependent variable, was satisfaction with life. And in another study, the outcome was happiness. And we measured those things in similar ways. And what we found was that when participants reported low levels of self-determination, then greater death thought accessibility reduced, it undermined their sense of satisfaction with life, and it undermined their happiness. But when they reported high levels of self-determination, they had high levels of well-being, regardless of whether they had death on the mind or not. And so what all of this shows is that existential concerns play a very important role in our social and mental lives. The concept of mortality can motivate our religious beliefs and can impact our sense of meaning in life. And it can motivate us toward authentic living with practical implications for student engagement and even for aspects of well-being such as happiness and satisfaction with life. There are just so many exciting lines of research and areas of research that this stuff can go in the science of existential psychology. And I'm really glad that I could share a little bit about my own research in this area with you today. And I hope that you enjoyed learning about it as well. So thanks again for inviting me today. And I hope that you all enjoy the rest of the afternoon.